Hi everyone, good to see you all here. I'm Jorik, I'm a writer, a teacher and an autistic advocate for neurodiversity. I'm also queer, an immigrant, and I have mental health issues. I live with my equally autistic partner, Luke, who's over there, and a large amount of cuddly toys with a variety of personalities and identities. This talk will be an exploration of autistic pride as I try to place my work in context with the tenets of queer pride. Some of this will be adapted from previous work I did, so if you read or heard some of these words before, I apologise. I only have the one life to draw from, so I might repeat myself a couple of times here and there. Also, content warnings for discussions of mental distress, abuse, death, depression, and medical abuse. This talk doesn't really have a title, but I'm going to call it On Pride. I don't like the word proud. It feels weird to say. I say it about other people all the time. I'm proud of you, I'm proud of you, I'm proud of you. Right now, I'm proud of you. Thank you. But I don't say it about myself. It's so important to hear. So I'd say it to people. But about myself, I never grew up to be particularly confident in my own skin. It's more likely I would have associated pride with pridefulness or arrogance and evil in general during my occasional flirtations with Catholicism scattered throughout my early childhood. I was diagnosed autistic at the age of 8. My first words were, "No, absolutely not." I was screaming through my tears. I tried pushing them back up with my fists, but there were too many to stop. The child psychiatrist tried to tell me in kind words that I was autistic, because there were a few connections in my brain that didn't quite link up right. It was October 1996. I was 8 years old. My parents were surprised that I did, but I put up a fight. I was not going to be one of those children. Instead, I internalized all the abuse and continued punishing myself for anything I did that showed I wasn't like anybody else. In my head, I had two choices. One, I would shut up, take the pain and humiliation, not cry, not show anyone I was different, not be difficult, not be anxious, not be angry, not be depressed, but to be normal in every aspect of my life without complaints or backchat. Two, I would go into a home. I chose the first. I grew up in Holland in the 1990s. In an interview I did a few months ago, I referred to growing up queer and autistic in a place that didn't welcome me. I never felt at home there. Not that I wasn't told that I didn't. I didn't fit in for several reasons, and people in Holland aren't shy to let you know that. To your face. I received homophobic bullying on a daily basis, even from complete strangers in the street. Apparently, as a child in 1993, I cycled in a very gay way. I still cycle in a gay way, but being 6'4" and in England, you tend to get away with those things. I ended up fighting my autism tooth and nail for 18 years. Why did I do that? Because of how I was made to feel not just different, but lesser than. On the one hand, I was told that I was just different. On the other, that I had failed. I didn't want to be a failure. I wanted to be good enough. My parents, my peers, and my school didn't stop punishing me when I had a meltdown or patronizing me when I would cry so much I'd be sick. Diagnosis or no diagnosis. Pardon me. My father personified this inconsistency. He would praise me one day, glorifying my memory, perfect pitch, and talent for impressions. He would humiliate me the next by making him look terrible by being what I was, a literal-minded, very obviously queer nerd boy who was frightened of him and of most other people. I fought, pretending that I wasn't affected by what other people said. The bullying stopped after my father ended his own life, as I was now fat, queer, autistic, had a stupid voice, was anxious, weird, poor, and a semi-orphan. I was too easy a target. The bullies gave up. They had some self-respect, I suppose. Still, I was lucky. I was white, nominally middle class, and my mother cared. I never took my own depression, anxiety, and suicidal impulses seriously, as that would be being like my father, which I didn't want to be. Instead, I punished myself even harder whenever thoughts of suicide entered my head. The reason someone can get complex PTSD is a series of traumatic events, which means that the person's selfhood has been structurally eroded. Many autistics are highly vulnerable to this. By the time my father died when I was 12, most of the damage had already been done. By now, I despised everything about me. My body, my brain, the fact I needed to stop myself from kissing boys in school despite how terrible some of them smelt. That, by the way, is a thing. Children can smell how badly other children smell. It's a thing. I tried several times to make a go at being neurotypical. I ingratiated myself with different groups of friends. I got into drama school, where I was kicked out after 2 years for being autistic. I started university. I drank, partied, and did stand-up comedy. I crashed hard several times and beat myself up for failing. I got myself into hospital when SSRIs weren't curing me of what I now know was exhaustion, sensory overload, and anxiety. Instead, I was given even more drugs and got assaulted on the ward by another patient. It wasn't until I was 26, living in London, being so unwell that I was given an interruption from university and on an amount of sedatives that would make an elephant groggy, that my life changed. I met Harry. They fell in love with me and became my partner for 3 years and is still my best friend. They were an autistic person who were not ashamed of who they were. They were and are capable, bright, funny, beautiful, and they liked me because I was autistic, not despite it. I was apparently eminently clockable. I learned about how to cope and keep moving without constantly punishing myself. They were the first autistic role model I'd ever met. I was 26. When I was a child, autistic people were not part of society. The Netherlands in the 1990s saw no autistic adults publish books, appear on TV, or simply even be visible having a job. I knew no other autistic people. When I went to school, I made friends with a few other autistic students in order that I wasn't the autistic one. Autistic was an epithet. Autist was even harsher, and my father's repeated shouting of the Dutch equivalents to retard and Mongol still ring in my ears now. Harry was different. They were proud of being autistic as well as proud of being gay. Unfortunately, it was us against the world for a long time. It wasn't until we'd moved to Oxford, then broke up in 2017, that I started to create my own autistic family. After getting off the sedatives, I finished my master's, trained as a teacher, whilst trying to stomach 7 unfair dismissals in a single year due to being autistic. I crashed yet again after another firing. That led to my sectioning. I wanted to get sectioned as punishment for what had happened to my father, as punishment for failing to keep my job, as that was what had happened to my father a year before he died. The next day, the psychiatrist was baffled at seeing my medical history and the medication I was on. He said I should have never been put on the cocktail of medication I'd been on since 2012. He immediately changed my SSRIs. 5 days later, I got the job I ended up doing for 3 full years, teaching English as a foreign language in Oxford. I was headhunted by Oxford Health at a conference with Tony Atwood and was employed there as an autistic activist. The book I wrote was selected by Penguin for Right Now 2018 and is now in the editing stages for resubmission. I've been invited to join an all-autistic theatre company and I'm sharing my life with another autistic man. I've become a freelance teacher, autistic mentor, and educator in neurodiversity. I have made a life out of being exactly what I was told meant I would be yet less than human. All I can say is I was lucky. I'm still alive. When I lived in London, 8 stone heavier and on benzos, I had a meltdown in the street when the therapy I was supposed to receive fell through because I'd committed the crime of moving to another borough. I was lucky, as people thought I was having a bad time. If I hadn't been white, I could have ended up in prison, tasered, been forcibly sectioned and injected with what could have been an overdose of antipsychotics, or simply shot. I have been lucky that I was able to have a student loan from Holland to allow me to extend my studies, to have a family that's starting to understand how hard I fought for every crumb, that I'm able to work and thrive, that I have a gym where I don't get sensory overload, that I'm part of a thriving autistic community both in my local area and across the country. As I said, it took me ages to find my tribe. I wasn't able to keep friendships for very long as my way of making friendships was always on the terms of the other person, or I would be masking, actively pretending to be someone I wasn't, or both. With Harry and I, it was different. For years it was us against the world. We lost friends on both sides because I was clearly unwell for much of the relationship. At the end of 2016, my grandmother died. She was 94. It was not a tragedy. She had lived on a farm since she'd married my grandfather in 1953. He died 5 years earlier. I'd expected to mourn her since she was, getting on. But what I hadn't emotionally accounted for was that the farm would be sold. This was the place where I'd spent most of my life, either on visits or actually living there. Another thing about me, I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and my grandmother was so proud of me, especially since she had been taken out of school in the 30s when she was a child. In the Depression, she was sent to work as an indentured servant for 10 years, and her father was paid for it. When I would show her what I was studying, she was just so proud. I started thinking about how I would have survived as a queer autistic child in her stead. Not much later, the book started to drip out of my brain like candle wax. I wrote in my lunch breaks and between the swimming pools and the cafe shifts I did in between firings. Harry and I broke up and I trained as a teacher. In July 2017, I visited the Oxford Writers' Circle for the first time. There I met my partner Luke and several other friends I'm still in contact with. After my final firing, I went to Swansea to stay with Luke and read Neurotribes there, Steve Silberman's book. I bought it on the day of my graduation from UCL, and it was a huge connection. Just after that trip, I started my job as a teacher at EF. I stayed for 3 years. Again, personal record. I kind of became that neurodiversity and disability agony aunt. I could bring my personal experience into it, as well as my growing knowledge of what it was actually like to be autistic for people who are very different to me. In early 2018, I proposed I go to an autism event that was held locally in Oxford as a form of professional development. This was agreed, though I'd have to self-fund. I did, and made damn sure I wouldn't miss out on any of it. I would do research, primarily for the book, but also for teaching. This was oddly the first time I'd ever been to a place that was specifically aimed at making autistic people feel comfortable. I was 30. I'd been to a school for autistics before as a teacher, but it was NT-led, and they were using conversion therapy methods there at the time. That day I was headhunted by Oxford Health. I don't know how it happened, but I later heard that my later boss was taken by the way I was making notes about everything and the questions I asked Tony Atwood. A month later, my book was selected for Penguin's Right Now workshops. By now it was called Teaming, which is a title it still got. I went to Berlin to do research for it, since part of it takes place there. I also went out to the gay scene there. I know that my father had been to Berlin shortly before he died. I don't know what he did there, but I certainly had way more fun than he ever did, by being exactly what he hated me for being, both autistic and queer. At Oxford Health, I first did research on the state of autistic people's lives in the community. It was horrifying to see, but also kind of beneficial. I mean, it always is to see that one's perceived failings are due to external circumstances. I've written before about autistics being a lonely community due to the lack of knowledge about how to find those who are like you. Being a person of colour is usually shared with family. Being gay, there are some spaces to go, although furtive looks are difficult to discern even for neurotypicals. I then started an autistic experience group for Oxford Health, where I ran an all-autistic safe space for autistics to give feedback on the NHS. It was a huge success. I can say that now. There were no neurotypicals allowed in the room. It was an amazing place. We all could and did relax 100%. For the first time, I felt I was a genuine advocate. I needed an NHS badge to prove that I was, but, I did. My imposter syndrome was slowly ebbing away. My friend Jo, by the way, did amazing work in her MA dissertation on the experience of autistic experts by experience, and imposter syndrome was apparently present in every single one of the people she interviewed. Those days, starting in January 2019, were exhausting, primarily the wrangling with neurotypical members of staff. Added to that, I was still teaching 24 hours a week. I started attending events wearing my Oxford Health badge. I met Wen Lawson and my friend Rose at Didcot in November 2018. I went to the parliamentary inquiry on the autism strategy. I went to the Futurist Gold event in Manchester, where I actually met Steve Silberman. You can find a picture of me and him alongside Alan Turing on my website. Go and look for it. Did I mention I have a website? I have a website, by the way. I was nominated and lost an award in June 2019 at one of the most patronising and unintentionally ableist events I have ever had the misfortune to visit. Well, maybe not all that unintentionally. I went to the Autistica conference in June 2019, with whom I now work as a member of the Autistica Insight Group. On the way back in a boiling hot train carriage, rammed full of people, I saw a lady sunk into a seat as I stood in the aisle. Her mouth was hanging slightly ajar, like a torn curtain on a broken window. I knew what that was. I'd seen it before. She looked like my grandmother after she'd gone. I walked up to her and tried rousing her. Nothing. I touched her face, no response. I thought I felt some kind of pulse and called out for a doctor. Luckily, there was a doctor and a few nurses on the train, though despite regulations, no defibrillator. Now, I was a bit flappy, but I knew I needed to act since there was a possibility that she could have been saved. She wasn't. Her name was Annie. She was 78, and she'd been dead for a while when we got on at Reading. But would I have done the same had I not been wearing an NHS badge? Potentially, but my words would have had less power. I was a person who the police interviewed back at Oxford Station. The tears came after they'd left. In July 2019, I went to Autiscape, or Home as I like to call it. I met so many wonderful people there, including some who are speaking today. I continue to be involved with them because they're heroes. Now, some of you may remember that last year I was here in a different format with the Autistic League. In early 2020, the axe came down on all work Oxford Health was doing on the autism strategy, and I was let go. Why did I engage with the League? Because I felt I had to. I didn't want to let my community down. So I worked my ass off all the way through the first lockdown until a meltdown at this very event last year that meant I was fired from the League. I was severely depressed for 6 weeks and wondered whether to continue doing activism work at all. Surely I was now 100% cancelled for being a scumbag and a diva and everything that was bad about me. But I wasn't, oddly enough. Even with the person who fired me, I have had wonderful contact with everyone in the autistic community since then. I didn't have to pretend to be anything that I'm not in order to be accepted here. I'm allowed to fail. I'd never, ever experienced that before. I slowly started blogging again, moved to Reading, and started doing autistic training work, including this week for the American Association of New University Presses at Duke University in the US, over Zoom, of course. How do we express pride? We need to be visible. How do we get visible? Well, fight. Get on the streets. Write to MPs. Start a neurodiversity alliance at work. Be openly, visibly, proudly autistic at work, in school and in public. But if you can't do that, one way I love and that brought me everything that I do right now is by making beautiful art. Whenever other autistic ask me what they can do to fight a world that is disgusting and racist and increasingly fascist, I say that. We have to make art that's beautiful precisely because it's made in an autistic way. Culture is powerful, and it's one of the few ways in which individuals can make a difference in a radical way. Not just that, we have to aim to make art that's so good that gatekeepers won't be able to class it under specific interest or minority interest, but to actually be visible across society. I mean, they still might, but they'll have less of an excuse. My friend Harry's a stand-up comedian, and their perspective is that you can't be mediocre when you're marginalized. You have an even greater responsibility to make art that stands out in the best way possible. That doesn't sound fair, you might say. Why should we hold ourselves to a higher standard? But I agree. It isn't fair, but if a neurotypical wants to make bad art, there's nothing standing in their way and they'll likely succeed. Their style and approach to other human brains is already common and has an audience. The reason mediocre art succeeds is because it rewards those who are already invested in the status quo. Now, before I finish, I know I'm just ahead of Peter Tatchell. It's important to know that discourse surrounding trans issues has become a culture war recruitment tool. I'm currently working on with Stonewall to extend the ban on conversion therapy to autistics too, as even under this ban, we could be victim to conversion therapy if the provider calls it ABA, PBS, or states that we cannot be queer because we're autistic. If anyone's interested in collaborating on this, please contact me. I'm cis as far as I know, and I need to stand with my siblings in order to fight the continuing oppression they face for having the temerity to exist. As I said before, there is something about autistics that upsets people, which is very closely aligned to the, I don't know, he's just a bit weird, isn't he? That homophobes are used for decades to discriminate against lesbians and gays. I encourage Mr. Tatchell to come out stronger in support of trans issues. It is possible to deplatform racists and deplatform transphobes all at the same time, since they're usually connected. Unlike what was written by Kathleen Stock, a philosophy professor at the University of Sussex, I went to University of Sussex for a year to my shame, Kathleen, gay liberation is not at an end with marriage equality. This is a right-wing trope used in the Netherlands for decades to blame any homophobia present in society on Muslims. Don't fall for it, guys. Neurodivergent people are mostly LGBTQIA. Potentially, queer people are majority neurodivergent themselves. When it comes to race, despite the people speaking here today being overwhelmingly white, myself included, neurodivergence, like sexuality, has no race either. We should not let the far right dictate what we should and shouldn't fight for. No one is owed a speaking engagement, including myself. When I was writing this, it came to light that St. Peter's Hospital in London is no longer providing bottom surgery for trans men on the NHS. This is very serious, and ideological funding cuts will cause queer people, a large amount of whom will be neurodivergent, to lose invaluable and life-saving healthcare. In 2019, I was working at Oxford Health. I was asked to represent the Autism Experience Group at Oxford Pride. We were able to get a stall, and I was there all day, representing the NHS. There's a photo of me on my website, look it up. With me were members of the Experience Group. A few of us went into the big parade with the NHS banner in front of us, walking through the streets of Oxford on this boiling hot day. My makeup was melting across my face. Next to me was a 15-year-old autistic who'd just come out to me as bisexual that day. I was the first person he'd come out to. We were walking past a picket line where evangelical Christians shouted at us that God loves us and that we needed to return to Jesus. He shot me a look, fear in his eyes. I turned to the protesters and laughed. "Just smile and wave," I said. "We love you." Does that solve hatred and bigotry? Absolutely not. But for fear of sounding like David Cameron, it is the right thing to do. I knew that if we'd be rounded up tomorrow, I would go. I won't hide who I am, because 18 years ago, a frightened queer autistic boy needed someone just like me. I aspire to be exactly the thing that I was taught to hate about myself. That is, really super, super, super queer and autistic as balls. Now, with that poetic ending, I'll hand you back to your moderator. Find me on jorikmol.com. That's JORIKMOL.com. Thank you all so much, and see you around. Bye, everyone.